All right. Well, I don't know if we switch back to the screen? Okay, good, because I want to make sure you see this. Here's our next issue. Actions of behavior knowledge of employees. Okay. How we talked about liability, how local entities expose the conference. I think that's what I wanted to address. Liability, how do the local churches end up taking an action that now the conference is holding the bag? Liability will rise based on the behavior of the local entity that is part of the whole. So like we said, because you are part of an entire community, one person's bad action exposes the entire community. So, if I'm hurt, if a big brick falls on me when I'm walking into your sanctuary or a beam, I'm going to sue the conference. And the conference is the one that's going to be responsible. Something happens to my child when I brought it into the daycare, I'm not just going to sue the church, I'm going to sue the conference. All right? So we say the law basically says if you are part of a whole organization, then I can sue the entire organization for the acts of one. Also, actions and behaviors or knowledge of employees or agents. Employees or agents, we know who are the employees: pastors, teachers, right? Principals. But agents can extend also to members, volunteers, officers, board members. All of those folks are considered agents of the church at large and the conference. So there's this principle called ascending liability. What does that mean? It means the principle for this example, we're talking about the conference. The larger entity becomes liable for the acts of the agent. So if you are acting within your scope of your office and you take a bad act or you fail to take the right action, you then expose the entire conference through the theory of ascending liability. And who are agents, as we talked about? Pastors, teachers, principals, but also lay leaders, elders, deacons, Sabbath school superintendent, Pathfinder directors. All of those folks are considered agents and can expose the entire conference. Question?
What about if you do not operate under the conference name and doing whatever you do?
Right. But are you operating under your church?
No, so if you're not even operating under your church.
Okay.
As a name.
Well, let me ask you this. Are you operating on the church property?
No.
Are you operating with church assets?
Monies? When you say assets?
Or their car or the church van?
No.
Well, if you're outside of the church and not operating under the name of the church, then no, the church is not responsible. But once acting within your scope of work as the elder, as the Pathfinder director, as the youth leader, and you fail to take an action or you act negligently and somebody's hurt, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Question?
Okay, I'm trying to go. I don't know who's turn.
What if a member has an accident on the church property and she wants the insurance to pay for it?
What about it?
Yeah.
It depends. See, that's why lawyers make their money. Everything is almost always going to depend. The facts always determine what it is. So there's no bright line rule. It always depends on the facts. But to the extent that you can show there was some negligence, some failure on the part of the church, that can possibly expose the church. But just because it happens in the church in and of itself does not automatically means that they become liable. Yes.
The member tripped over some carpet that had started to come up.
Yes.
And she sued the church.
Of course.
Put some tape over it.
Yeah, but she can sue the church. Or it's slippery and icy on a Sabbath morning and no salt, or we didn't block out that area and somebody slips and falls and breaks an ankle, yes, liability can ensue.
So what about, you mentioned Pathfinder leaders.
Yes, I'm getting there.
When you, oh, you're going to talk about it?
Go ahead.
If you are on, say, a particular event, but leaders, they're not the directors, but they are quote unquote, I would say, staff members with children who are part of the club, where do you draw the line if a parent, a staff, but parent, is making decision that you see as a risk if we follow through, but, well, it's my child. At that point, the argument is, well, it's my child. I can tell my child what to do. How is that handled?
Let me give you an example. Here's an example. There was a field trip at a school, and they were trying to figure out how to get the class over there. One of the parents actually was a volunteer to take some of the kids in her car. She got into a car accident on her way to the field trip. She sued the school for the accident because she said, on my way to the school trip, I was acting for the benefit and in the scope of facilitating transportation for the school. And therefore, if I get into an accident, the school is responsible. And the school had to pay. Their policy had to pay. So that's a good example to say, if they are acting within the scope of their position, now if it's with their own children, you'll be hard pressed to try to find a claim. But just because they have a child in the club, that doesn't immune their obligation as a staff member in the club.
Yeah, just brief question here. Typical situation, let's say a person takes self-proclaimed ownership at their church. They may leave their belongings there overnight or use the church as storage or keep their car there. Let's say that happens. Is the church liable if something happens to their item?
Possibly.
So let's say they take it upon themselves, okay? Over time, they leave their stuff as a storage, even though there's no authorization, the church can be liable.
Possibly. Under the right set of facts, possibly.
Okay, thank you.
Such as, if you grant permission, if it's a let's say there's a gate. For example, let's say there's a fence. And it's supposed to be locked every evening. And you don't lock the fence that leads you into the parking lot. And someone breaks in and locks the door and damages their property. They could make a claim that but for the negligence of the church, my vehicle would not have been damaged.
They took it upon themselves to leave the item there.
I said it all depends. You give me the right set of facts, I can possibly find liability.
Okay, so if they say, you know what, I'm going to leave my car here, leave this information there, the church could be liable.
Possibly.
Okay, all right, thank you. All right.
No.
Sure.
Pastor Wood's statement, they were not authorized, but a elder or a deacon knew of it, then they possibly could be legally responsible for it because he knew, but he didn't do anything about it.
Exactly. So he could actually argue that he was authorized because someone of authority knew about it and didn't say he couldn't do it.
A question. Thank you, sir. Tell me, the renter of a building, a church building, your church, however, if the renter even gets liability insurance giving us the right to, releasing us of liability, are we still responsible for anything that happened while they're in attendance there?
Possibly, but that's why you always do ask that they provide their own certificate of insurance in hopes that, and you ask that they provide it at a certain level that there's going to be sufficient coverage so that they don't have to dip it to yours. And I'm going to get to that. All right? Let me go back to the screen if we can. So what we were talking about essentially is the parent organization does become liable for the acts of its subordinate organization. So that's why we're talking about local entities. That's how they get you. Vicarious liability is the other theory that they use. They impose them a liability on a person for the actions, conduct of another based solely on the fact that they are in a relationship. So we are part of a church community, and you and each of us are a part of the whole. So there is vicarious liability on the conference because of the relationship with the church. All right, so what are some of the examples, some specific examples, you guys gave us some, of how local entities expose the conference? Selecting unsuitable volunteers. What do I mean? People who you know should not be working with children. People who you know have anger issues. People who have demonstrated to you that they're unfit, but we don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. That is in part how we expose liability. Question.
Okay, so the question I have is, if you, at the nominating committee, chooses a person that should not be chosen because of past performances or past behavior, and the nominating committee says, we will allow you to select this person, but this person has to be trained by the person, by another pastor or whatever, and you choose to ignore those recommendations from the nominating committee, and so the training never takes place.
Right.
And that person does something that is detrimental to the church because of lack of training.
Right.
Whose responsibility does it then become if something like that happens?
Remember, I said you are all part of the conference. So I said, how do local entities expose the conference? One of the best examples is using unsuitable volunteers.
So one more question. So does the chair of the committee have the right to say, I don't have to do that because I don't see anything wrong with the person?
I mean, they can always say it, but we're talking about what are best practices that minimize exposures to liability. Best practices is unsuitable volunteers should not be put in positions that they're not suited to, and sometimes that means there's going to be hurt feelings. But you are trying to do what is in the best interest of the conference.
What about first day churches renting?
I'm getting there. I will get there. I promise you I will get there. Back to the screen if I can. So what are some other examples other than selecting unsuitable volunteers? Going to your issue, failing to supervise volunteers or employees. You have kids taking out kids. You have people, like I said, Pathfinders is a great program. But this day and age, you better make sure you have responsible folks.
I did want to make a point, I guess, sort of kind of to your statement. As a conference, we do have insurance coverage. And if you do have unsuitable volunteers where you know they have an issue or there's a history of a certain type of background that doesn't make them fit for the role in which they are serving, and the occurrence, something happens, the insurance does not cover that because that means you were aware of the situation. So let's say I have sticky fingers and you make me the church treasurer, And if some money comes up missing, and if anybody on that church board was aware that I had an issue with stealing money before, there is no recovery available for you through the insurance that we have as a world church, because there was prior knowledge. And so you put me in that position with the understanding already that there could be a risk that I could take something. Same thing applies with other types of behavior.
And like I would say, hey, God grants grace, there's love, there's acceptance, but you don't have to serve in a certain role that you are not suited to serve. All right? Question.
Yes, our church has a very active community services department.
Right.
Which is great.
Yes.
We sometimes have volunteers from the community. Are there issues with having volunteers who are not members of the church? And secondarily, sometimes they want to bring, because they say it's a great experience, like when we feed at the community shelter. Some folk want to bring their children with them, or they want the children to help us when we're doing distribution and, opening boxes and that
Right.
kind of thing. Is there any age recommendation that you should not allow volunteers under a certain age or that kind of thing?
I don't know if we have a bright rule. We just say common sense. But like I said, the goal is not to stop ministry. Ministry still has to happen. We're just saying we got to be a little more prudent and a little more proactive. When certain people are unsuited, then, the feelings of an unsuitable person should not trump the safety and the financial well-being of your church and your conference, right? What are some of the other examples? The third option, it's on the screen: hiring or firing your own employees improperly. So what are we talking about there? Many churches have to have local hires. Sometimes your secretary is a local hire. Sometimes the conference only approves a certain amount of teachers, but you have to add or augment to that teaching staff or staff, so you will hire locally. So if you hire improperly, once you hire an employee, you are subject to a whole host of laws and regulations. And if you hire them improperly, if you fire them improperly, if you supervise them improperly, if you don't pay them the right way, if you don't give them the benefits that are required by law, you open yourself up to a lot of liability. Entering into bad contracts is another way that really exposes conferences. And one of the big ones that we see all the time is copier contracts. Churches are, they will love and tell you, hey, come get this new copier so you can print out all your bulletins and programs, and all you got to do is sign this one pager, but they make you ignore all that fine print that's attached to the contract, which gives the copier company all these powers to come after you if something goes wrong. Signing bad contracts can expose the conference because they have some very heavy remedies to go after people when you breach that contract. Renting church property or facilities without safeguards. What are we talking about, safeguards? I wouldn't ever rent your church without requiring that group to provide their own certificate of insurance. Because anytime somebody's entering into your premise, if things happen, if there's a slip and fall or they trip, they can initiate a lawsuit. So it's best practice if somebody wants to rent your church facility, even if it's for an occasion, a wedding, and it's not a member. You shouldn't charge your members. But, you have somebody coming in who wants to rent your space so they could do their services on a Sunday. I would require that they get a certificate of insurance. But work with your conference, because there's a way that your insurance certificate needs to be written to provide coverage. Because there's something called additional insured on the certificate, which means the insurance is on notice that if something happens, they're going to have to pay that entity. You have to make sure that the right entity's on the certificate of insurance. I've had people write the local church, but the local church isn't the property owner, it's the conference. So when it came time for you to try to get access to the insurance, they could say, the entity who actually owns this property is South Atlantic Conference. That's not who was named in the certificate of insurance, so we don't got to pay. Allowing the use of church-owned property for non-church related activities.
I have a question, I'm sorry. And you kind of mentioned it, you said, don't charge your members. We get this question a lot. Well, there's a member that wants to use our church. They're having a family reunion, and they want to have...
No, I didn't say don't.
Well, I'm not saying pay it, but they want to use the church, and it's
Right.
not necessarily a church activity.
Right.
What type of legal, I guess, responsibility do we have to that church member if something happens to somebody? Do we require them to have insurance as well?
It's all, that's really a judgment call for the conference or the local church to make as to what courtesies they're going to offer their church members. But understand that when people come onto your premise, you have exposure. Somebody tried to do a summer camp on church grounds. Kids were playing football. Kid trips, breaks his leg on the field. He sues the church. Church has to pay. It happened on the property. So there's always risk. The question is, to what extent does the church say you are a member? Obviously, weddings, funerals, things like that. Maybe a baby shower. But the question is, how far does it go? But the one that I was really focusing on is using your property, allowing the use of church-owned property for non-church related activities without safeguards. The biggest thing I'm concerned about is people trying to do commercial activities on your church property. I think you have to be very careful. Understand that in the U.S., churches are considered tax-exempt property, which means they don't pay property taxes. The law has basically said the church is a good for the community. It serves the community, and it's not there to make money. And so the trade-off is the church property is exempt from paying property taxes. But that is as long as it continues to function as a non-profit entity. So let's say somebody wants to run a catering business and they want to use the church kitchen. Or let's say somebody wants to run a mechanic business off of the church property. The local tax assessor can actually designate that property as losing its tax exemption and now is subject to being property taxes because it's being used for it's no longer a nonprofit entity, it's a commercial enterprise. So this is one of the nice ways that you can say no without hurting people's feelings. We don't want to lose our tax exempt status, so we don't allow commercial uses onto the church property. And there's all kinds of liability that rises. Maintenance and selection of vehicles can cause issues as well. What kind of vehicles am I talking? Yes.
Going back to my brother's question, I know you dealt with a commercial use of the property, but if we rent the church on Sunday,
Yes.
And that is an income to the church,
Yes.
is that considered?
No, because it's still being used for a nonprofit status. If it's being used for as a house of worship, still, they're just renting it from you. And as long as it's, and there's some complications, but because you are part of the conference, what they look at is what percentage of your income is outside of the nonprofit sphere. But because you are part of the corporate entity of the conference, they would have to look at the entire giving of the conference to determine if you are out of balance. And it takes a lot to get there. So generally, you can rent your property, your church property, to another church for worship and not trigger the loss of your tax exemption status. So that's a good question. All right, but it better be in writing. It should be a lease agreement, and you better get a certificate of insurance. with the proper person insured.
Should it be voted through the church body?
It should be voted at,
The administrative staff of the church, the pastor, the head elder, the deacon, you know, and avoid having a business meeting. I mean, it's so
right.
simple.
I would prefer business meeting because you are talking about the church property, but at least the church board should have taken a formal action to allow it. At least.
So just for clarity, you said there should be a rental agreement.
Yes.
So that agreement defines what they can and cannot do in the facility?
Yes.
Does it also cover what property they may bring into the facility?
Yes. You want to be clear, like, for example, our church has been used as a rental. We say no candles or open flames into our property. Your usage is between, 9 and 1 p.m. on Sunday. You have use of the church sanctuary and these rooms, and that is all. We give you these parking spaces. Your rent is due on this date. The term begins on this date and it ends on this date. You want to be clear about what your relationship is with this entity.
So before we move any farther, because the renting of the church is a very popular thing.
Yes.
And so we rent the church and we draw up a contract. And we're from the, First Day Church.
Right.
And we're in the parking lot and I dent her car. Can that congregation by any means sue our church?
It would really depend on a certain factors of what caused the accident.
No, you know how we get out the car
Yeah.
and we just dent the car.
Something
Usually
like that,
that's it.
I don't think that would trigger liability on the church itself. But the factors that led to the accident, depending on what it is, that is what would determine.
So, like there
Loose
weren't proper
gravel,
lines.
right? Or loose gravel, or you didn't ice up de-ice the parking lot, things like that.
I'm sure you've looked over your church's rental agreement. Can we get a copy of that?
I can try to get it to you. Actually, we have about 20 to 30 attorneys at Capitol Hill, so I'm not the one who did it, but I do have a copy.
Okay.
I'll forward it. I'll forward it to the conference, and then you guys can get access to it. No problem.
So I heard you say earlier, since the property belonged to the conference, so therefore the church has to involve the conference and when they're renting or notify them of it?
It's wise that you do so. It is wise that you do so, yes.
I was just about to mention that all rental agreements are to come to the conference office for our legal counsel to review. And we should know every time the facility is being rented, whether it's long-term or short-term, because once again, who holds the deed and title to that property? The conference. And so if someone else is allowing property to be rented who does not have the ownership of it, that creates another problem. And so we're just trying to alleviate all problems that could possibly arise. And we're not trying to micromanage, we're just trying to make sure that we cover all of our bases. And so we have legal counsel available at the conference office to review every contract, whether it's a copier contract, a rental contract, a janitorial contract, a landscaping contract. We ask that all contracts come before the legal counsel of the conference office. That's to protect the local church and the local conference.
And that's a great policy.
I'm just asking, in this day when you have marriage that's kind of broad in general, how do you handle if your church is, they say, yeah, you can have a wedding here, but then you find out it's
Same
yeah,
sex?
it's the same sex, or What do you do? I mean,
The good news.
I mean, legally,
Here's
do
the
we
good
have
news.
to, do we
Here's-
have to honor those?
No, the good news is this. At least in the U.S., as of today, the laws are that they cannot force you to violate your own religious principles and beliefs, and especially if you're in a church. Now, the rules are a little different when all the way up to the Supreme Court if you have your own business, but about whether or not you can be held liable. Yes, the Baker case. But as far as a church facility, they cannot force a church to violate their own religious principles. So as of today, Canada's actually about to pass a law that'll make it so even churches can't discriminate. So things are changing. More examples: selecting unsuitable employees, failing to this is how the conference can expose itself. So I'm gonna tell a little bit to the conference. If the conference selects unsuitable employees, if they fail to supervise their own employees, not following NAD policy or GC policy that is there to protect them, if they enter into bad contracts, poor documentation, failing to investigate when a claim is made, fail to give proper training, failing to properly address red flags and potential issues can also expose the conference as well. And let me just give you one example. I'm only on slide 14. I'm gonna have to slow fast. What is one of the biggest exposures? Yeah, which kind of vans?
15 passengers.
None of y'all have 15 passenger vans, do you? No. Okay, that's right. You should have gotten rid of it. You know, really, the policy that I had up on the screen, it used to say should not, but it has moved to you cannot have a 15 passenger van.
I'm sorry, I came in late, so I don't know where you are, but and if my question is not appropriate now, just redirect.
Okay.
I have an HR background, and some of the things that frighten me is when we have an interview process. I don't think our local churches and our conference, even the executive committee, even that level, is educated on proper questions that you can and cannot ask.
Right.
Also, when it's time to investigate a situation,
Right.
I find that just from some of the things I've heard, that we are an HR nightmare when it comes to our investigative. What kind of training?
I think the amount of exposure, legal exposure that's out there right now, I think almost every conference should have somebody who specializes in HR rules, practices, and regulations, because there are so many pitfalls. In fact, I think the number one liability right now to conferences are employment lawsuits. So that means our own pastors who are suing conferences is the biggest potential claims right now that are happening. Yeah. Good example of, you want to know why the church moved from should not to cannot own 15 passenger vans? These were 2 accidents, one in Florida, one in New York, multiple fatalities. Using 15 passenger vans, those 2 accidents alone cost us $30 million. 15 passenger vans are de facto unsafe. They are known that at a certain speed, if there's a sudden turn, it's going to flip. All right, so anyone you see in a 15 passenger van, you should be, if there's any time that you should jump up and down and put your foot down, is if somebody's trying to use a 15 passenger van.
So the church doesn't have a 15 passenger van, but we're going on a basketball trip, and the deaconesses have the proper van. No, they got the right one. They got the church's van, but Deacon Mosley has a 15 passenger van, And she said, well, y'all can use our van. So now it's not the church's van.
Right.
But our basketball team is on it.
The church is now liable. Yes. Yes. The church becomes liable if anything happens. You go and rent a 15-passenger van because it's cheaper. The church is now liable. In fact, the second accident that we saw, the church said, hey, we're going to buy our own policy. So the conference won't be liable. It was a $300,000 policy. When the accident happened, the insurance company cut the check for $300,000. They put it in the courthouse, canceled the policy, and said they were done. Because if you look at any insurance provision, there's a cap. And once they reach the cap, that's the end of their exposure. So they were like, oh yeah, this is a bad one. $300,000, here it is to the court, we're out. That did not stop the lawsuit. Because like I said, it was $30 million between those two. So once that cap was gone, guess who they came to pay for that? Exactly. Let me see. Infinity fraud. What am I talking about? This is fraud between people with some common bond. That's essentially what affinity fraud means. I go within my community to swindle them. That's essentially what affinity fraud is. Almost always it's within a religious group, ethnic or racial group, or professional group. Who knows who this is? Very good. Very good. Right? That's Ponzi. Yeah, y'all ever heard of the Ponzi scheme? Ponzi scheme was where everything was too good to be true. I'll give you a great return, but you just got to bring somebody else. And every time somebody else brings some money, you get some of theirs. And you've heard that before? You get some of theirs, and then they bring somebody else under them, and they bring some, and you get a kip. Yeah, it doesn't. Well, it works for the people who get first. Right. But that's the Ponzi scheme. Who knows who this is? Exactly, Bernie Madoff. You know what was the genius about Bernie Madoff? He got to a point where he kept telling people no. He said, no, I'm too busy. And then they would beg him even harder. Please, please, please take our money. And he's like, no, I did my portfolio. No, please, I'll give you even more. And who did he start with? He started with his community. Yes, it started with his own community. So what are we talking about? Churches are a community. They are a family, which means they are a right target for affinity fraud. So what are we saying? Fraud among people of the same bond, investment fraud, 5 years losses, the last 5 years of infinity fraud in excess of $60 billion. That's a growth industry, because the previous 5 years was only $450 million. So $60 billion, right? So why is it so attractive? Too good to be true. Can't miss. You put in a certain amount and you're going to get a ridiculous amount of return. If it sounds, it does, and it's true. All right?
If we all purchase from the same company and the church would get a big refund, does that apply?
It depends.
Does that principle
It
apply?
depends. I mean, because Amazon does that. That's not bad. Walmart will do it. But then it's usually a very small. When you start seeing these huge returns for very little investment, can't miss, you should be very worried. If we could go back to the screen. This is an example of an individual. He was an elder of a church in the Bronx. Not only swindled his employer, he swindled the Adventist church. It was a total of $3.5 million. I can get a big return so we can buy this church property and do God's work, and I just need y'all to give me all the money and then I'll take care of it. But we say, so why does that matter? When losses occur, investors or victims always look to the deeper pocket to see how they can get their money back. and the church will be a convenient target. Why is that? Because church leaders may have promoted the investment, or the meetings to do the pitch was done there at the church, or the pastor told you, or the elder or the deacon got up on the pulpit and said, hey, right after AY, we're going to have this pitch by this guy right here, so stay. So you are almost endorsing the activity, which then you are exposing the church. Presentations are made at the church. Testimonials are given by church leaders saying, hey, I met this guy, this is great. That endorsement may be enough for them to turn around and look to the church when there are losses. So protecting church resources, what are we talking about? We talked about internal theft. We talked about nominating committee, unsuitable volunteers. We love you. God's grace is there. Forgiveness is there for you. But that doesn't mean that you have to serve in the Treasury Department if you have a conviction for theft. You know, if you have to register as a sex offender, you can't work in Pathfinders or AY or a Sabbath school. Right? God still forgives you, but we can use some prudent issues of what you can and can't do. There's just some basic things that we say we should do. Always have 2 or more people counting. You know, keep written records. You want immediate deposits of funds. You know, that person should not act as if the church's books are proprietary and nobody can see it. Those are all the type of red flags that should trigger some concern. All right? NAD working policy says that when dealing with offenders, we report them. And to tell you the truth, you can't even recover on your insurance policy if you don't file a claim. Right, police report. So that is the policy. All right? Employee issues, we were talking about that. Local hires. Who is the employer is a question that we need to answer. Like we said, the church is not an incorporated status. So one of the safest things to do, your conference has payroll. Your conference understands how to withhold the right amount of taxes, what the law says about minimum wage, or how to make sure that they don't qualify for health insurance that you're obligated to provide. All these things are there. So we almost always say, use your conference. Almost always they have that local hire provision. Maybe they're not going to pay for it, but they can run the payroll for you. They can run the immigration check for you to make sure that you're not in violation.
What happens if you know something happened and you did not report it to the conference as a claim? Who's responsible?
Ultimately, first of all, once somebody's going to file a lawsuit, I'm going to start digging around to figure out who got the pockets. So more likely than not, I'm going to probably start zeroing in on the conference because that's where the deeper pockets are. I may sue the church, but eventually my judgment is going to be against the conference. So like I said, lay leaders can make decisions or fail to take the right actions that can expose the conference to potential liability. That's why they're there. That's why y'all nominated these officers to hold these positions so that they can make these hard decisions for you. All right, so let them know. So we just talked about all the different obligations that come in. So the courtesy payroll that the conference can do, and that's basically you are paying for that employee, but they are running it through the payroll for you to make sure that you are meeting the legal obligations. Question?
So you're suggesting that, say if a church had a business of some sort, you know, a school, that the conference actually do the payroll, all the processing of the payroll, everything that's
especially
involved
if
with
you
that?
don't have the capacity. Especially if you don't have the capacity, because here's the thing. If you violate some of those laws that are in place, as far as wage amount, as far as the proper withholding, taxes, whether or not they qualify for insurance or other benefits, if you fail to do all that, the amount of liability that can arise because of you made that mistake can be pretty high. In fact, let me give you an example. If you fail to pay a W-2 employee on time, they are eligible to go after you for triple damages plus attorney's fees. Because the law doesn't play about when you say somebody's payday is on this date, you got to pay them on that date. Or you better terminate them before and give them what you owe them up to that date. Because if payday comes and you don't pay them, there's a world of consequences that can fall on you.
South Atlantic has taken, the question was, do we have a courtesy payroll? We have asked that all employees at the local church level be paid through the conference. We call them LFEs, locally funded employees. So any employees that you have, we've asked that they be paid through the local conference. And just to piggyback on what he said, we do have pay dates within the conference. And so if they're locally funded, that means that the funds from the local church has to reach the conference by the designated date for us to meet the pay date. Otherwise, the exposure happens to say just what he shared, this person did not get paid on time. So we need the full cooperation of everyone. The local church has to send their money in on time so that the conference can pay that employee within a timely manner. Okay. And now that does not contract employees. So if you have a janitor that you have a contract with, and you give them a 1099, that's different. But somebody that's an employee. And that runs through our HR department.
How many hours,
Part-time or full-time. So you become full-time when you work more than 30 hours on a consistent basis weekly.
Right. Which could almost trigger your obligation to provide health benefits. So you better be very, very careful of those decisions.
I was going to ask, what determines whether a person receives benefits? What?
Number of
Just the
hours
number
that they
of
work.
Okay.
I could give you a simple thing. For example, with the Affordable Care Act, they basically said any organization that has 50 or more employees, any full-time employee, and they define full-time as working more than 30 hours a week, the employer is obligated to provide them health care by law. Okay? So the cost of harassment and discrimination, what are we talking about? People behaving badly, touching people the wrong way, having inappropriate conversations, all of that. Courts are not playing. They hold managers, they hold leaders responsible for bad behavior. In most cases, your general liability insurance does not even cover actions by managers that have been found to be intentional. Or in other words, a repeated offender that you guys have left in place. After a while, your insurance carrier ain't gonna carry continued bad behavior. Adverse impact. Even a facially neutral employment policy or behavior, if the facts are right and it results in a disproportionate, unlawful behavior of a protected class, can end up costing. For example, here in South Carolina, the BMW plant had to rehire its black employees and pay $1.8 million in damages for discrimination.
I was just going to say, a lot of church members fight to actually get on a board, whether it's the church board, whether it's the executive committee. You fight for these positions, not realizing the liability to being on there. ignorance does not excuse you from the law. You cannot keep saying, well, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. Well, you should have known it.
Right.
But you should have known. So I don't know, and I didn't know that took place is no longer acceptable anywhere, especially the higher you sit, the less you can claim ignorance.
Right.
And shame on you for claiming it if you've been in a position 5, 10, 15 years.
That is exactly right. You know, we call it workplace harassment, but we can even call it in the community. Harassment is any unwelcome verbal or even physical conduct. It can be based on race, color, but also based on sex, age, sexual orientation, not so much in the church. But conduct that makes somebody feel uncomfortable and is unwelcomed is considered harassment. A hostile work environment can even also apply to volunteers. The law has already said that I can put in a claim for a hostile work environment even if I'm a volunteer. Me Too movement. What are we talking about? It's a big change where pretty much old behaviors, like Elder Preston had talked about, where in the past people used to just tell people just be quiet and leave it alone. Not anymore. Everybody will rise up and make a claim, and they are entitled to. The law is actually on their side. The pendulum has swung. Sometimes you have false claims. Yes, that happens. But more often than not, Me Too is basically saying we are trying to change this culture where inappropriate behaviors were set aside. It was embarrassed. It wasn't discussed. They're bringing it out in the open, and they're raising a basis to get a legal claim against an organization. So accusations of sexual assault, sexual harassment, church leaders are not immune. In fact, I think the big growth industry of sexual harassment claims are coming within the church relationship. So what is sexual harassment? It could be dirty jokes, dirty emails, unwelcome touching, verbal contact, suggestive remarks, anything that you know you shouldn't be saying, any kind of conduct that you know you shouldn't be conducting, anything where you would be embarrassed if they recited what you was doing or what you said on the pulpit, then that's unwelcomed and inappropriate. So it could be explicit or it can be implicit, used as a basis for affecting somebody's ability to hold their position. All of that is considered harassment. So even intimidating, hostile, saying, okay, it's unwelcome, now I'm gonna keep you out of everything. I'm gonna turn rude, I'm gonna give you a cold shoulder. All of those things are considered a hostile environment, and it raises a claim. It's also inappropriate. And so we really need to transition to a zero tolerance policy. We don't tolerate it. It is not acceptable. We're not just going to let it go. Question?
Say that you were conducting a sermon and you had a gay couple to come in.
Uh-huh.
And they began to kind of act out their behaviors
right
as they sit and listen to the
right.
sermon. And you pointed out
from the pulpit.
From the pulpit. Can that be looked at as harassment from their viewpoint?
It's a little different. I would probably say calling it out from the pulpit is probably not the wisest thing to do. Here's what I'm going to tell you. Understand the people who are coming into the church, they're invitees legally. That's a legal term. Mm-hmm. Invitee, which means I've opened my place to the public, so you are welcome to come in as long as you follow our rules and norms. You decide you don't want to follow my rules and norms, I can disinvite you. which means you then become a trespasser if you continue to come. So the easier way to do it is to basically say this conduct is not acceptable and you are free to leave. That's the best way. They become, and at that point, if they refuse to leave, you can call the police and they have to be, and they can be removed and arrested for trespassing.
So you can publicly feel pretty safe in stating it that way. The reason I'm saying that because you've got members that are looking on, and we teach against certain behaviors and lifestyles and stuff like that.
I agree. My recommendation is you disinvite them rather than pointing them out from the pulpit. I would go to them and tell them they are disinvited.
Okay.
And I would tell them that behavior is not acceptable, and you disrespected our congregation by the way you behaved. You are no longer welcomed here.
That should be, like the pastor saying, sending the deacon, not just members.
Yes. Let's reserve those actions to your pastor, your elder, your deacons to take those actions.
My issue is sometimes in small congregations, particularly family churches, everybody knows Uncle So-and-so is
Yes.
a perv, okay? And they have known it for generations, but he was never legally caught.
Mm-hmm.
And he's a member of the church, and then they elect him to a position of trust.
Mm-hmm.
And the people that are in the family and that know about it, which is everybody, it's very offensive.
It is offensive.
It's not prudent. To me, it makes no sense. And I see it over and over again. And their rationale is, well, we're a forgiving church, God forgives. But even though God forgives, there are things that have consequences.
Exactly.
And I'll just cite this as an example and sit down. But I think this was early 1990s. I was in the military in another state and conference. And there was a seaman that was accused, not only accused, he confessed that he molested two of his co-workers' children while caring for them. He was African American and they were Caucasian. It was all over the papers, was a known entity. He was being court-martialed, and also there was a civil action. This was in the paper, and I was away and came back, and I saw this person teaching youth Sabbath school with no other adult in the room, and I went to an elder, and I was hearing the reasoning of the people, because I asked the board this, what is wrong? Like, what is wrong with you?
Right.
And I felt like I was the only person that either had common sense or I was in a parallel universe. It just didn't make sense. And they said because his court-martial wasn't complete. And I said, this is not prudent.
Right.
So I will sit down and let you
No,
respond to
that is exactly right. And I always say, look, there's always competing interests. And I will take the safety of children over the feelings of an adult. That's the way I couch it. I'm sorry, I'm going to put the safety of the children over the feelings of the adult. So you're right, because if something happens, the church should be held liable because they knew or should have known that they were putting these children in a position of danger. All right? So summary definition of sexual harassment, really unwanted or unwelcome behavior. Contracts. I'm trying to speed through the second half. Contracts. Basically, different contracts that we're talking about. Real estate, rentals, copiers, hotels, bus contracts. We know Camporee's coming up. So there's going to be a bunch of transportation provisions that are being made. All these things, vehicle purchases, vehicle rentals, all of these things are contractual relationships. We always say the biggest thing that a local board needs to know, a local pastor needs to know, is they need to educate themselves with the conference. What is the limit of the authority? What authority have you delegated us that we can take? And what authority do we need to go check up with the conference based on what that action is? All right? Almost always, if it's involving the church property, you almost always have to go to the conference. But even certain hotels, transportation contracts, especially if it's over a certain amount of money, you should probably check with the conference. Why is that? Because the law, and this is the other thing, contracts is basically a set of promises that the law is going to enforce, where you have a remedy at the court. It can be verbal or it can be written, but there are certain kind of transactions the court will not even consider if it is not in writing. Rental, real estate purchases must be in writing. A will has to be in writing. There's a whole bunch, a contract that is over a year must be in writing, or it cannot be enforced. So what we say is, we don't expect you to be the lawyers. We don't expect you to know the law. What we do expect you to do is to know when you need to probably contact the conference so that they can provide you the resources and the help. So what is it that should be in a contract? It needs to identify who the parties are. And remember, we said if you're doing real estate, the party isn't the church, it's the conference. Maybe on behalf of this church congregation, but whoever owns the property should be the party to the contract. You should know who you're contracting with. Sometimes there are corporations, sometimes there's a partnership, they may be an LLC, they may be an individual. So you have to know who the identity is. Is there a mutual understanding? Did we put all of our issues or the agreement in writing? Are we on the same page? Don't always assume that you have the same understanding. That's one of the reasons why you do the contract. What must each party do? And then after that, and that's usually can be handled in the first paragraph. Everything else that's usually in the contract is called "so what if I don't" clauses. So the issue is basically, okay, you agree to pay me X and I agree to do this. That's usually covered in one paragraph. Everything that comes afterwards is normally, what are my powers when you don't do what you're supposed to do? And if you're not careful, you will find that those contracts will only protect the one side and have no provisions on what's supposed to protect you. How do you get out of the contract if things go wrong? Does it explain it? Is it in writing? What's your maximum exposure? Have you negotiated those provisions? All of those things need to be taken into consideration. Even sometimes people forget to actually put in, how much are we getting for this? And so there's not even a provision for you to enforce what your damages are if things go bad. And of course we say, get legal review before executing this contract. What you usually pay to get a contract reviewed by an attorney will probably substantially lower than what it would cost you if you get into a bad contract. All right? Questions that you definitely want to ask yourself as a board: do I have authority to negotiate this contract? Do I have an authority to sign this contract? Do I need a way out? Do I say, okay, this all sounds good, but we don't have authority to sign, so we got to take it to the conference. We got to take it to someone else, and then we'll get back to you. That's the best way to get out of it. Just tell them, we don't have the authority to sign, but we can take the paper and we can get back to you. Because once you put them on notice that you don't have any authority to sign, they really shouldn't even be pursuing your signature anytime after that. Conflicts of interest, what are we talking about? You are in a position of authority. You also have, if you sit on a board, you are considered to be acting as a fiduciary. That term means you are acting on behalf of the entire church congregation or the organization. So, as a fiduciary, conflict of interest means you can't be making decisions that's going to benefit yourself or your family. Those decisions, any decision that you make in authority needs to be what is going to benefit the organization that you represent. Question?
Would you consider it a conflict of interest? Let's say a church has a building project going on, and then you as a church member have a business.
Keep going.
And you try to put your bid in. Is that a conflict of interest when you have your own church business, your own personal business doing
And
church
you
business?
are part of the decision-making authority that's going to decide who gets the business? Yes, that's a conflict of interest. Because here's what and even if it's a close relative, because here's the thing. The issue is you as the person who have oversight of the project, are you doing oversight or making decisions that's in the best interest of the church? When you have somebody that's too close or yourself, you are compromised. That's what the conflict of interest is. And, it's not ethical, right?
Even if you have the lowest bid.
The question is this. You should, right, if you have insight as to other people's bids, then it's not ethical. If you are part of the decision-making process, that's unethical. If you have influence over the people who make decisions, that's unethical.
I wanted to go back to the contracts. What if it's a member who owns a business and there's work that needs to be done at our church? Is there a contract required? What type of responsibility do we have to the member? What type of responsibility does the member have to the church? What do we do? I've seen a number of scenarios.
I have too. I'm not going to ever tell you not to contract with a church member, but I say, if you decide to do that, let's agree that we're going to treat you for this purpose the same way we would treat any other contractor, which means we want you to have a contract. And if our policy is that the plumber has to have a certificate of insurance before they come into our property and mess with our pipes, then you better have a certificate of insurance. See, the thing is, what you have to do is to say, if things go bad, what is our recourse? And if we treated you exactly like we would have treated every other contractor, then we would have made sure that we had protections for ourselves. So you want to go into business, you want to do a business transaction with the church, you expect to get paid on time when the work is done. So by the same token, if you mess up, the church should put the right protections in place to give itself the options to remedy it. And if that's uncomfortable for you, then let's decide not to go down this road so that we don't have to have this discomfort. So you could have a policy that just says, we've had bad experiences, we're not going to do business with members because we don't want hurt feelings. But if somebody want to go ahead and do the business, then understand we're going to go in this and we're treating you the way we would treat every other contractor. We're going to put the same requirements on you that we would put everyone else. We're going to hold you accountable like we would hold everyone else. And if you think that's not something that you can do or it's too uncomfortable, then let's just decide not to do it. All right?
Now, I was listening to that. Now, for instance, we have a daycare center, we have a church.
Uh-huh.
The daycare is a part of the church on the same premises.
Uh-huh.
However, the daycare is not paying any money but to be there, but they have their own insurance
policy.
Policy.
Uh-huh.
So now, in the event that something were to happen there,
the policy could kick in.
Their policy will take care of it, and the church will be alleviated for any liability.
It all depends.
It all depends on
how much damage is caused. Because if the damage exceeds the policy, you best believe that the attorneys ain't gonna stop. They ain't gonna be like, oh, we have a $2 million judgment, but the policy is only good for $500,000. Okay, we're just gonna take $5 million.
So how do we rectify that?
First of all, you talk and make sure that depending on the activity that is being done, that they have the right insurance provision in place. and you want to make sure that you have a contract that lays out, if they are a separate entity, you want to lay out that they are a tenant. But if they're not a tenant and they are part of the church, you know, you get a healthy policy, but understand that if the issue is serious enough and the judgment supersedes the policy, they have the right to go after the church too.
Okay, so now you stated what constitutes a tenant?
Yeah, somebody who pays rent,
okay,
who has a lease agreement.
I want to make sure, you know, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Because if they're just there and just existing and something were to happen, however, they still have that certificate of insurance. But if they don't have enough, you're saying that they can come and get.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
So it is on you to make sure that they have a strong enough policy.
And if they're not paying rent, they're not considered a tenant.
No, if they're not paying rent, they're not, and you don't have a lease agreement, they're not a tenant.
They're part of the church.
Exactly. It's a church activity as far as I'm concerned. All right. Back to the screen. What?
Because I want to get clarity
I'm
on this
hearing
because
you.
it's important. Because if they're incorporated.
Incorporated is good. Incorporated is good, but it only really protects the owners from inheriting the liabilities of the corporation.
Okay.
All right? But you're talking about a premise liability if something happens to the child on that property.
Exactly.
So like I said, they will go after that policy, but if the damage is high enough, and like I said, the insurance always gives you a cap. Yeah, we cover you, but we cover you up to this amount. Anything above and beyond that, we're not responsible.
Okay.
All right? Let me go back. What do I have? 14 minutes? Okay, I'll be quick. This is important. Child protection, volunteer screening. Who knows who does the screening for the Adventist Church?
It used to be Shield the Vulnerable.
It used to be Shield the Vulnerable, but now it's who? Very good. Verified volunteers. Every 3 years. Everyone involved, that was the old policy. Everyone involved in working with the youth must meet the church's legal standards and the requirements such as a background check. Local church leaders should consult with the conference, right? That's what it says in our church manual. That's your policy. But it was now extended. NAD working policy in 2017, I believe, might have been 2017 passed FB 20. FB 20 now says all church ministry leaders and officers who are voted or appointed by the local church are required to do a background check.
Who determines the depth of the background check?
Verified Volunteers does the whole background check for you. All right, so basically, it's not, you don't have to worry about how much it's done. Your question is, who has to do it? And now, it's not just the people who are working with Pathfinders and AY. If you are a church officer, a ministry leader, you have been voted by nominating committee or appointed as an officer, you have to go down, got to go through a background check. Now, if you're working with prison ministries, the prison ministries leader has to do a background check. Someone who is a staff member for the prison ministries probably does not. But if you are working with children or youth, every adult, 18 or older, must do a background check, whether you're a counselor, a staff member, ministry leader, driver, everybody must do a background check.
The reason I ask is because I know there's a different price on a SAC background check when you go into the depth of the verification costs more. So who determines that?
The conference has already, well, the policy and the contract that we have with Verified Volunteers has already determined. If you're going to work with Treasury, there's a different background check that you're going to get. If you're going to be a driver, they're going to do they're going to check your driving record. All right, but if you are serving as a deacon, an elder, Sabbath school leader, a Pathfinder director, Pathfinder counselor, children's Sabbath school teacher, no exceptions. I don't care if you've been doing it for 50 years. And here's the hard part, board members. If somebody refuses to do a background check, sit them down. Period. We are not God. We cannot discern who can versus who can't. And lawsuits isn't based on bad behavior. Lawsuits are based against organizations for failing to take the proper steps to create the safe environment. So we were already on notice that churches act badly. And we have enough examples of adults acting badly in churches against children. So your denomination came up with a rule and says if you want to serve as a church officer or with a youth ministry, children's ministry, you must do a background check, no exceptions. So you go to nominating committee, you tell people up front, you must undergo a background check. Well, I don't believe in violating my privacy, blah, blah, blah. Thank you. You can still come to church. You can still sit in the pew and enjoy the service, but you cannot serve. Question?
So do we have a deadline? Because if I'm hearing that since January and this is June and I'm still hearing it or still seeing it in the bulletin, so-and-so need to do a background check, where is the cutoff or a deadline for accountability?
A reasonable time, and I think a reasonable time is within 60 to 90. 90 should be the outside. I really go between 30 to 60 days. You got 30 to 60 days to get it done. The clerk gets the report of who has got the background checks done and who haven't. When that deadline passes, I don't care how long you've been a deacon. I don't care how long you've been an elder. The church board can take an action that says all those who have not taken their background check will no longer serve. Period. Should be the board. The board should take that action, and you need to enforce it. And people's feelings get hurt, but that's the requirement. You want to serve at our church, you got to do a background check.
Excuse me, this is James Lamb. I'm up in the booth.
Yes.
Just want to put our members at ease. The background check is not to find out what you may have done in the past.
Right.
It is not to be used to keep you from serving in the church. In the South Atlantic Conference, only one person sees the background checks. And what we are looking for are predators. We are also looking for drivers or people who drive that may have a bad driving record, or if people are handling money, we want to make sure that they have not done something dishonest recently. A number of our members have done things in the past before they knew Jesus. We don't hold that against them. But if you are a church driver and you've received 6 super speeding tickets in the past 2 years, you are eligible to serve, but not as a driver.
Exactly.
And so that is what we're looking for. We do not hold anything against you, and we don't put that information out. Pastors have access to see who has done the background check, who is eligible and who is not eligible, or to see a person is eligible, but they are eligible but a non-driver. And so that is what we're looking for. So as you talk to your churches, your church boards, let them understand that your past is not used to keep you from serving. We are trying to protect our children in the area and the church from areas where we are getting the lawsuits. And it is from drivers with bad driving records, predators that are coming in hurting our children. And also, sometimes a person is dishonest and they do take some of the church money, but if we know in advance that they may have a problem with being honest, they are eligible to serve in any capacity, but not with funds. And that is what we're looking for. And so some church members don't want you to see their past. They're
Right.
ashamed of it. And that's why they don't want to. It's not everyone who refused to do a background check is a predator.
Right.
They just may not want you to know.
They just may not want to do it.
What they've done in the past, but we don't use that against them.
Right. And the Lord still loves you. You can still fellowship, but you can't serve. All right, if you don't want to do the background check. One of the things we say is people who want to work with youth, there should at least be a 6-month waiting period if you're brand new to the church. That's just good common sense. And I know sometimes you are desperately looking for good people. I'm going to go fast because I'm almost out of time. Trademarks and copyrights. Let me do this quickly. You all know what this sign means, right? Yeah, you know when you see that you're at McDonald's. And guess what? They are fierce in protecting their trademark because they don't want people to imitate who they are. There are certain people who have never taken action to protect their trademark. For example, the Baptist Church. So tomorrow I can set up a tent and say, hey, I'm a Baptist church. There's nothing anyone can do to stop me from saying I'm a Baptist church. We have registered the Adventist Church, the name and the logo, as a trademark, and we try to protect it vigorously, which means only those who are within the church denominational structure can call themselves Seventh-day Adventists as far as their facility or their church. But in order for us to continue to protect it so that Adventists always mean the same thing, we can't be selective on how do we enforce it. So what we say is all of you guys are our best defenders. If you see an unauthorized congregation, an unauthorized use of the church logo, you let us know and we try to put a stop to it. The working policy says that all churches, which includes all of your congregation, that is part of our denominational structure, has the right to use the name, put it on your apparel, put it on your bags. You can use Pathfinders on your t-shirts, but here's what you can't do. You can't use it for commercial use. So if you decide you want to sell something with the Pathfinder logo or with the church logo, you actually have to get permission. And the way you get permission is you contact the Office of General Counsel at the GC, and then they will give you a license. That's what I was talking about, so I'm going to fast forward because I'm almost out of time. I got 3 minutes. Copyrights. What are we talking about copyrights? In short, it's an exclusive right to have control over something that you've created. A song, a poem, a dance. There's a whole kind of things that fall into it. But for church's sake, we're usually talking about music. So what does the copyright give the person? It gives them the right to copy it, to distribute it, public performance, displays, or derivative works of that creation that I did. And basically what we're saying is if somebody has a copyright, you have to get permission to use it, or you can get fined. Copyright infringements are incredibly expensive. One of my colleagues in the Office of General Counsel, their main job is to stop people from using our trademarks, but for the most part, she's negotiating copyright infringements. Our church members who are grabbing stuff from the internet, putting it in their PowerPoint presentation, putting it on their website, putting it on their promotional materials, and they don't have permission to use it. People are now creating what they call bots. Bots are basically robots who have been programmed to go into internet and look for stuff that belongs to other people. And once they find it, then they look to see if you have a license for it. And if you don't, they send you an infringement notice, and they can be as expensive as $10,000 to $25,000 for unauthorized use. We try to negotiate a lower cost, but guess who gets hit with the tab once we end up paying it? Exactly. The conference gets the bill for every copyright infringement. So what we say is you have to get permission. Here's what you have to know. The church is exempt from a copyright infringement if you are performing a music during the church service. However, what is not covered is if you decide to start streaming, if you decide to do videos, if you start to post the service on your website. Anytime you transition to that exemption that belongs to the church no longer applies. What do we say you have to do? Get a license. There's something called a CCS license and a CCLI license, and there are some other type of licenses we can help you. But essentially we're saying you pay the fee up front and it allows you to play the music while you're streaming your service live and all that other good stuff. That is the last of it. I am out of time. If you have any other questions, you can always contact your conference officials, and they always will come to us, and we are available. So we're telling you, continue to do ministry, but let's be smart, let's be prudent, and let's protect the interests of the church so we can finish mission. I just must not be doing a good job because I keep getting invited back. Huh?
I hope that you all have enjoyed this. Like I said at the beginning, I just wish that someone from every church was here. The rules have changed. And whether we know it or not, we still are held accountable. And so we want to thank Josh for coming. We want to thank him for the presentation. And I'm serious about next year because we cannot get enough information. We cannot get enough. There's too much going on in our churches, and where people think it's just, it's my church, it doesn't affect anyone. Whatever you do at your church, wherever you are, it affects 150 other churches. And that's a good idea, but I tell you what, let me speak from a pastor's experience. And guess who will come out? Just the faithful ones. But what we're going to do is keep trying. We're going to keep inviting them back until he just says no. Okay, because hopefully next year we can double the attendance and keep growing and growing and growing and growing so that we can spend more money advancing the cause of God instead of at the courts. Yes, ma'am?
I think it was last year, or year before last, someone asked a question about children going back and forth to the bathroom and who was responsible for that. And you got up and said, let the parents take their children to the bathroom. It was not the ushers or the deacons. Most time we only have one, two in the churches anyway. And last year when we were here for a deacon and deaconess meeting, I asked how many churches were enforcing that. Not one church was enforcing, telling the parents, you take your children to the bathroom. The doors are open, somebody could be already in the bathroom, somebody could go right in and get turned. That's right. And they just will not do that.
Well, we just keep, listen, it's like raising children. You got to keep repeating yourself. You just got to keep repeating yourself, and hopefully it will sink in sooner or later. Service starts at 7 o'clock, so we want you to have your afternoon break, get a little rest, grab a bite to eat, and I'll come back this afternoon at 7. The preacher this evening is Elder Compton Ross. He's the pastor of the Decatur Seventh-day Adventist Church in Atlanta, Georgia. We know that you're going to be blessed. Let us stand. Pastor Valentine, would you offer closing word of prayer?
Father, we thank you for the information that we have received. We ask, Lord, that you will give us wisdom on how to diligently utilize this information. Help us, Spirit of the living God, to do that which you would have us to do, that we might continue to do the work that you have called us to do without the hindrances and without the impediments. Bless us through the rest of this day. May our rest of our encampment be a blessing to us and a glory to your name. In Jesus' name, amen.
everything the Lord said, wait.
Hey, darling. Fine, you do all right. I'm so asleep on the whole. I know. I love your hair. Thank you.